Hello, and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co host, Cameron McAllister. In this episode, we talk about the alleged sin of empathy. This conversation is developing, particularly in conservative, politically conservative Christian circles. What is going on? Isn't empathy a good thing? We talk about it, and we hope this is helpful to you. As always, if you like what we do, you find it helpful, you find value in what we do, you can support us by going to www.toltogether.com and then spread the word. Write a review, tell people about us. Thanks.
And today we're getting Nathan's hot take on the conversation around the sin of empathy, and then we'll get Cameron's slow take on it. It's one of those things that's been batted around for a little while now. People have asked about it, and it's still has some staying power. So I thought uh, everybody listening should at least know what it is and be familiar with the conversation. I think by and large, it's in some degree a silly use of language that almost always turns into a political conversation, and there's a degree of truth in it. So stay tuned to see how we parse that all out. But let me give you a little bit of a history on this, and that'll help us, I think, ground ourselves as we move forward. So I think it's been some time, like a couple years ago. Joe Rigney, who was president of Bethlehem at the time, is a teaching fellow at St. Andrews now, lives in Moscow, Idaho, was on a podcast with Doug Wilson, and some people will be familiar with that name, and discussed this idea of the sin of empathy, or the problems with empathy. In the times in which they were talking about it, Beth Stuckey, who some will know as a Blaze TV podcaster, relatable, very much in the political right Christian, very popular podcast, young women kind of side of things, wrote a book titled Toxic Empathy. So, um, Joe Rigney kind of came up with the idea first. It was discussed. Beth Stuckey kind of, I think, beat him to the punch of writing a book on the own topic. Her subtitle is Toxic Empathy: How Progressives Exploit Christian Compassion. And then that was followed up later when Joe Rigney himself um, wrote his own book called The Sin of Empathy. And this is still batted around. In fact, I think just a month or so ago, he was on a podcast with Al Mohler. And so, yeah, still part of a big part of the conversation. And then let me just throw one other caveat in there is you have a quote from Elon Musk. I think this came up something he tweeted or in a podcast with Joe Rogan, where he referred to empathy as the downfall of Western civilization. So that if you're not apprised of this conversation, you might be sitting there thinking, "Whoa, what in the world is happening? What's going on here? How are we talking about toxic empathy, the sin of empathy, or empathy as the root of Western civilization's downfall?" Because by and large, most of you listening are probably Christian or Christian adjacent and have thought of empathy as a good thing. And in fact, we've often lamented the loss of empathy. A lot of the research on the social dynamics of the cultural breakdowns as it comes to human interaction, when we're looking at the impact of social media or digital technology, is that it reduces empathy. And so oftentimes we're talking about everybody in the world seems to be using empathy as a good thing. And then all of a sudden you have kind of this Christian movement, or political movement in Musk's case, referring to empathy as a bad thing. So let me give some definitions and try to be as fair as possible to making the case as it comes along. Empathy, a lot of these conversations and argument go back to the idea of empathy as sort of projecting your feelings and your emotions or your experience into something or someone else. Many of them will point out that it's originally used as an art term where you would connect with a piece of art that you would emotively express yourself and attach yourself to it. So you're empathizing with it, it resonates with you. And then empathy moving into this idea of being able to um, empathize with another individual, which is you take on their experiences and you can, we use the phrase walk a mile in their shoes or something like that, where we're kind of getting behind what does it feel like to be that person. Now, when you listen to Joe Rigney, has, uh, I don't want to underemphasize the fact that this is almost always a political conversation with a Christian theological addendum attached to the back end of it. So it'll start off in the conversations kind of quickly sounding Christian esque, then jump deeply into politics. And so that would be one of the critiques that people have of this. Is this a political ideology looking for Christian justification, or is this actual Christian theology looking for an application? And I think it's the political rather than the theological. But here's the argument. It says that the sympathy is good, compassion is good. These are all biblical categories and ideas and terms. But If you're thinking of empathy in the sense of um, a, a pity sort of thing, it would say that if you came along and you found somebody who's in a pit and you threw them a rope, that would be sympathy. That would be compassion. You're standing on the ground, you're going to pull them out. If you empathize with them, you jump into the pit with them. So empathy is seen as an embracing of that person's uh, situation in life as a full jump both feet into their situation. Um, if you listen in the technical, and this is me trying to strongman the argument here, steelman the argument, is to say that when you use, for example, Joe Rigney's definition of the sin of empathy, he would say it's when you jump in and empathize so deeply that you lose your own sense of identity and your identity becomes wrapped up in the identity of the person who's in the mess. That is possible, and when I say there's a kernel of truth to it, let's remember that. I think a lot of people pushing back to this idea would say everybody from a counseling or mental health situation knows that good counsel and help does not do that, that you maintain your solid footing while you're reaching your hand and extending your hand to help somebody who's in a, less than desirable situation in life. And so, really, it does kind of, to some degree, come down to the semantics of what do we mean by empathy, and also looking at the nuances of what it means to empathize to the point of losing your own identity. That's where the sin language comes into it, is when we're empathizing to the point that we're no longer helpful in the situation because we've lost our own core values, our own footing, and we adapt and adopt our identity to the other person's problems. And so I think, yeah, there's a nugget of truth in that. That could very much be what happens. However, most of the conversation is not around that by the time it scales up into the cultural war language. And so if you look at Beth Stuckey's book, what are the categories in which progressives have sort of tricked Christians and weaponized compassion? So she's going to look at immigration, abortion, sexuality, gender. There's another one. A couple of these hot button categories, which you say that the church is uniquely vulnerable to being manipulated because of the degree to which we care about other people and other things. And there is a sense in which um, once empathy becomes the highest virtue, then all of a sudden you have to. Oh, Black Lives Matter. That's the other one that race fits in there,
Hmm.
of saying that there's a cultural force that you have to empathize, and you have to empathize in a certain way, independent of facts or anything else that um, has to identify you based on the other person's emotions and feelings and experience. So that's the when I say it's a funny use of words. I think some people are using it recognizing that the title is provocative to say the sin of empathy, but they're really, if they're talking about it at the sin level, they're talking about changing your identity based on somebody else's emotions. Um, Again, I want to reemphasize that it largely becomes a political conversation. I think particularly around the Elon Musk versions of that, and the Christians who are talking about this are, um, by and large, politically right Christians, and there's a nugget of truth. So that's my threefold theses. We can work out the and when I want to clarify what I say when I say there's a nugget of truth. The ways in which I've seen this lived out are not necessarily at the political level. But there is always that tendency, I think, to want to so deeply adopt into the desire to be included or to empathize with somebody that we lose our footing and we lose our place holding mark of saying the church is on a solid rock and we're inviting people into that. We're not jumping off the solid rock. And people say, well, Jesus, he empathized with us, he left glory and came and dwelt among us. And I would say yes, but that is a Jesus didn't lose sense of his identity and who he was in that process. So I think that's the healthy Christian version, is the incarnational sympathetic element of it. Not that like I'm just, looking for calls to identify with. I get the feels from somebody else. I adopt their feels and that's who I am. So that's my 8-minute speed summary. Cameron, I'm sure you have some questions and follow-up thoughts, and then we can go a little deeper into the weeds as needed.
I mean, there's a typical strategy to take a word and define it in a very narrow sense, and then use that narrow definition to push forward your own agenda. And I do think that that's what we're getting here with the word empathy. You see, particularly in that conversation with Al Mohler, they tried to make a very sharp distinction between compassion and empathy and say that these are two different
Mhm.
things. I will say Joe Rigney doesn't say empathy outright is bad. It's not always bad. He does make the case for the fact that empathy can be a good thing. He just thinks that it often is misused. But of course, as these conversations develop online and in certain sectors, politically, particularly when they're politically motivated, then you do have people saying basically all empathy is bad. But I just want to be clear that Joe Rigney's not making that argument. I can't speak to Beth Stuckey. But
Mhm. Well,
so
that's why I wanted to focus on the identity part from Rigney. I think was
yes.
the actual theological core of the argument there.
Yeah, so I mean, you have that. Now, I guess part of what I want to draw our attention to here is that empathy is often used in conjunction with discussions on the arts, as you said, Nathan. And that's because if you're going to, for instance, if you're going to write a story and you're going to craft different characters, I'm going to bring in a term that you may remember, you may be familiar to some of you from some of your English classes, and that is negative capability. Do you remember this term, Nathan? This is a phrase.
Nope, I chose to positively forget that.
Yes, you've repressed the memory. Good on you. Well, this is actually from the poet John Keats, and he was describing Shakespeare's uncanny ability to give you fully fleshed out characters regard and of all sorts of different moral stripes, basically. So Shakespeare can give you a very strong character who is very virtuous, but he can also give you an Iago, a truly evil character. And in if you scan Shakespeare's plays and try to find Shakespeare in there, try to pinpoint the author, where has he written himself in? You can't really do it with Shakespeare, says Keats, and I think he's right. A lot of other critics have backed this up because he's so pours himself out to make these characters that you can't Shakespeare basically disappears. If you're going to do that, you first of all you have to be an artistic genius, so which Shakespeare was, but you also have to have a very high degree of empathy. You have got to be able to walk a mile in very different shoes. Now, for me, there's a real fascinating aspect to this, and a lot of authors and different thinkers have explored this, filmmakers have explored this, because if you walk a mile in somebody's shoes, there are inherent dangers. It's one thing to just write somebody off, put them in a box and categorize them, and then you can kind of objectify a human being. Now, it's not a good thing to objectify a human being. When we think of objectification, we usually think of lust or something like that, but there are other ways to objectify somebody. If you hold them in contempt, for instance, the only way to hold somebody in contempt is to reduce them. You have to have a caricature. Even if a person behaves abominably, which of course, sadly, people do, you're still robbing them of their personhood if you objectify them and just narrowly categorize them. So some of the ways it may sound like I'm going off topic, but I'm not. I'm trying to illustrate how powerful empathy is, and I'm trying to illustrate some of its inherent dangers. So one of the stories that has looked at this quite closely, and all of these stories have been made into films, was Thomas Harris's Red Dragon originally. The more famous story is Silence of the Lambs. But what's interesting about these stories is that there's a detective in these stories who is very good at capturing these ingenious psychopaths. But part of the reason he's so good is because he's able to sympathetically and empathetically walk a mile in their shoes. And the movies less so, but the stories really look at the tension of him as a person and his own moral character as he does this. And some of the more incisive psychos, like Hannibal Lecter, whom a name many of you will recognize, relentlessly throw this back in his face and essentially say, "You're just like me." And there are a lot
Yeah.
of stories of characters where the bad guy will say, "Hey, you and I aren't so different." But anyway,
Mhm,
so I'll stop
mhm.
there for a second.
Well, let me say two things. One is that um, just to read push on the political side here is to say that the argument is being made that on Stuckey's case that progressives are weaponizing empathy, that it's not
Mm,
neutral, that you're asking to be invited in to have sympathy in a certain way, and then that starts to that's it's actually seen as a weak spot among Christians, and like if you want to get Christians to change your mind, this is how you do it. Now, the reason that that argument has a little bit of force is because we do see that happening, Cameron. Um,
mhm.
You might know a pedophile, and it turns out, hey, you know what? They're actually a pretty nice person. They pay their taxes and they drive the speed limit and they're nice in the neighborhood. And then you'd be like, wait, what are you talking about here? So the ability to think that somebody's a great person or a nice person, and I'm not saying that I do, just to clarify here, but um,
Or just a person.
we have
Let's
this
just
sense
start
of like,
there.
oh,
Just a person.
I just got to. They're just a
Just a
person.
person.
But
Yep.
if you look at the history of Christian theology, or let's look at Richard B. Hayes, recently deceased, his The
Okay.
Widening of God's Mercy, and you look at maybe how he wrote and had a historically classical theology of marriage, and then at the end of his life is going to say, yeah, you know what, I met some people who believe other things than I do, and turns out they're perfectly lovely people. This can't be wrong. That would be a case in which Christians have, or I met somebody one time who's like, oh, I got to know this person, and they're gay. And you know what? They weren't weird at all. And I'm like,
Nicholas
whoa, hang
Wolterstorff.
on a
The
second.
same story.
Yeah, but I'm saying, like, why
Yep.
did so what is the Christian vision that the person who believes something different to you is like you're almost making a caricature of that person that has nothing to do with theology or reality,
Okay.
and then you get to
Let's
know
talk
them and they're
about that.
not like you had been stereotyped, and then you're like, they're not like what my stereotype
Yep.
was, therefore they're right.
Okay.
Um,
Let's talk about that. Let's pause
it's an
there.
interesting
Very
argument.
important. Okay. That's
Fix
extremely
it, Cameron.
important. Well, I can't fix it. I'm going to make it harder. So
Okay.
it's easier. It is much easier to dismiss people by dehumanizing them. It is much easier to go after people's positions also by dehumanizing them. I'm not saying that the two necessarily go together, but in political warfare, they often do go together. And so a lot of people who are let's take the issue of sexuality for instance. So a lot of people who stand for a traditional Christian sexual ethic. It's just true to say, Nathan, that many of them have never actually had a real friendship or maybe even know somebody who is gay. Now that's changing. That's changing because many more
Mhm.
people are coming out. And that's going to continue apace because the sexual revolution is seeing its full flowering and we're going to see more and more of that. So a lot of people who basically change their minds. Let's take some of the prominent examples. You mentioned Hayes and I mentioned Nicholas Wolterstorff. Both of these are very respected Christian intellectuals. They're also public intellectuals as well. And they stood for traditional, Christian sexual ethic, but then they both began to their hearts were swayed by people that they knew. And I mean, Wolterstorff's argument is basically, I know wonderful people who are gay and in committed monogamous relationships. Now, some people who are just focused on the arguments alone will be very frustrated by that because that's not really an argument, and it's not. But there's something very powerful when we actually see a person as a person and we recognize that who holds to habitually what we would recognize as habitually sinful patterns of behavior or lifestyles is still a human being. Now we have to hold those two in
Mhm.
tension. Now it's a good thing to hold those two in tension, but unless we've really come to face this fact, we're going to find ourselves on shaky ground. And this is where some of the Beth Stuckies and all of those are reacting because they're saying, whoa, 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 don't fall prey to the sin of empathy. Well, that's not falling prey to the sin of empathy. That's because somebody hasn't really had their horizons broadened by seeing other people and really thinking along the lines with them. Is
Yep.
there some danger there? Yeah, I'll pause there for a second.
Well, because what you're highlighting is that the danger is not with empathy, it's with the flimsiness of the Christian
Yes,
identity.
precisely. You know what it reminds me of, Nathan? So when in the wake of 9/11, the conversation regarding Islam took on a whole new level of urgency, very understandably. And I remember a number of friends saying, "Oh, don't, well, I don't want to look at the Quran. I don't want to look at the Quran. And my pastor has told me not to read the Quran at all, not to look at it." And I was taking a religion course at the time. Why? They were afraid that they would be converted. And so
Mhm.
immediately when you hear that,
Rattlesnake will get you.
right. So the problem's not inherent with the Quran. The problem is the flimsiness of the faith of the person. If you lack confidence and stability. So if are you so unconfident that you can't have a friendship with somebody who has a very different viewpoint from your own? Or are you so unsure that you can't countenance the fact that there are gay people, trans people who are also, decent in the sense that they're nice, kind individuals. They live upstanding lives. It's easier if it's the pink-haired person in the Taylor Swift shirt, as you always allude to, Nathan, or somebody who could
Screaming
who
at somebody. Yeah.
well, somebody who fits really easily into some sort of a cultural stereotype. But when you step outside of social media, outside of the world of sensation and hype, and you actually meet real human beings, it really can be a shock to the system and think, "Oh,
Oh,
wow,
okay.
this is a person." Yeah.
So I'm going to say this, and then we can decide whether or not it's true. I think that both sides of this conversation are wrong. So let me make this case to you. So one side, and they're both wrong in the same way, in that they're politicizing a theological concept. And so you'll have
Mm,
a a religious right side of this saying, "Look, empathy is being weaponized against us, da 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 da," da," and then you'll have the responses to that whole empathy thing saying, "The lack of empathy is the sign of a sociopath, and that's who you guys have elected as a political leader,"
sure.
and it becomes a liberal Christian talking point against a politically liberal Christian talking point against a politically right Christian talking point, and we've taken the entire conversation and moved it from our interest in the relationships that we have with other non-stereotype category humans, and
Yeah.
we've punted that up into a political conversation, while now we're speaking in generalities about people that we don't even know.
Mhm.
And so that to me, when I'm listening back and forth in this conversation, it just seems like this is a miss in both. So
Yeah,
is it categorically true that both sides of the argument could be wrong in the proper application
yeah,
of the way in which this should
yeah.
be manifest in our lives?
Well, let's talk a little bit about the different political sensibilities here. So let's hone in on the political side real quickly and call in our good old friend Dr. Jonathan Haidt. He's our friend because we don't know him personally, but we reference him enough, and that counts. But he'll tell you that if you look at the political sensibilities, broadly speaking, the right is concerned with fairness and the left is concerned with equality. Fairness and equality are both good things,
Well,
right? And yep.
no, so he juxtaposed fair and just
Okay, so
and
fair and
care and
just.
harm
Okay.
as and then there's also loyalty, authority, and sanctity are the conservative virtues, and
Mhm.
then the freedom, fairness categories are the more liberal personality skewed. Yeah. Anyway,
Okay, so
to
justice and fairness.
confuse
All right.
things as you're going.
Good,
Yeah.
helpful correction there. Well, but if you're concerned with justice, so it's understandable that a lot of Christians and right-wing individuals, I'm not conflating those two, by the way, but people who are of a right-wing persuasion, they're concerned that empathy can cloud our moral judgments if we're not careful.
True,
And that's true.
and
And
that's true.
that is. Mhm. And that doesn't mean empathy is toxic. It doesn't mean empathy is necessarily a sin, but it is true. We can allow our hearts sometimes to leap out of our chests and cloud our judgment a little bit. So sometimes there will
And
come
then
a
you adopt all the puppies.
right, exactly. So there are situations where very difficult decisions do need to be made economically, s- politically. I mean, you name it. I mean, and then this is a fallen world, and we can't afford to be idealists. And in its best instantiations, the conservative disposition tends to be it's not very glamorous, but tends to be the picture of the responsible person who is spending carefully, thinking about what resources do we actually have, what can we actually afford to do, can we house these people, for instance, do we have a stable infrastructure to do so? But on the other side, the liberal sensibility, which is very cares deeply about fairness and compassion and helping everyone, is also a very good balancing act to say, look, all of these people are human beings. If we're talking about the immigration crisis, for instance, many of these people, they're not lawless individuals. They're political refugees or their families seeking a better life who have risked life and limb to be here. Those are also valid points. It's an important conversation, and we need both. We need both. But I'm just trying to bring this in here to illustrate why a certain audience is going to be more sympathetic or empathetic to a critique of empathy because they can see that misuse and they can see the way some of these things get politicized. Although I do have to roll my eyes a little bit about how compassion is being weaponized. Everything's being weaponized in the political world. It's hardly the left who are the only ones doing that. And increasingly, we see the right taking a leaf from that playbook as well. So all that to say,
Well, so
we're equal opportunities,
yeah, well,
opportunity offenders there.
just to clarify there, when you hear the conversations of the Christian critique of the concept of the sin of empathy and the emotionalism that's manifest there, that crew is very as is going to say, well, the right does that with fear and emotionalism. Every immigrant is going to rape you, kind of thing. And so there's an emotive.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm just
Yes.
putting a second layer of paint on what
I
you're
mean,
saying. Emotions
you could write a
run both
you
directions.
could write a book on called The Sin of Fear and make an
Yeah.
equally valid point about what the ways in which fear has been weaponized. Yeah. And indeed some books have been written like that. But
Okay.
anyway.
Let me tell you a story, Cameron, from my childhood that might give us a little bit of an analogous understanding of this, and to think constructively for us as Christians moving forward. When I was, I don't know, I was probably 10 years old. One of my brothers was 8, and the other was 5. We were playing on the hillside. Some people would maybe call it a mountain in our backyard, and we were going across the face of it. And only in West Virginia is the topography such that you can fall off your backyard. But anyway, we were going across this place that it turns into rock, and you kind of have to do like kind of rock climbing sideways across the face. And our youngest brother was going first and fell. And as he was falling, he caught a little tree. So he's hanging from both hands from this little tree branch, and it wasn't far, maybe like, I don't know, 12, 15 feet to the bottom, and it was a little bit angled, but you definitely couldn't walk on it or climb up it. So if he let go, he was gonna slide for sure. And, I had a rope coiled around my shoulder, and so when he fell and he's down there and he's crying, screaming, as you would, I turned around to look for something to tie my rope to, because 'cause I'm like, "If I can get my rope tied to a bigger tree, then I can lower myself down there and get a hold of him." Well, in the meantime, my other brother, who is perhaps more empathetic than I am, just couldn't stand that his little brother was down there by himself. So he jumped off to go be with him. Um, and he got down to him, except the little tree branch couldn't hold both of them, and they both fell all the way to the bottom. And so by that time I had my rope, I got down, ran back to the house to get some help, and everything turned out to be mostly fine there. But I think in that we see the conservative would look at that and say, "Look, here's somebody who." So the conservative and the con, the political conservative and the liberal conservative are both going to look at the same situation and say that's bad. The conservative orientation say, okay, and what do we hook our anchor to while we work to solve this problem? And the hyper empathetic and not always helpful response is like, how do we be with and identify with in the situation? And so I think the church actually needs both kinds of people working simultaneously. Like, you have to have the heart and you have to have the structure and the stability. You can't be canoeing, see somebody in the water and say, okay, now we're going to shoot holes in the bottom of our boat so we're all in the water together. Um, you have to have the structure that is stable in order to pull people into. And so I think you're reflecting on my own childhood. That wasn't like my brother's liberal and I'm conservative. It's just I was the older brother and had the rope, and so that's the decision that I made. But um, that that type of thinking is something for us to keep in the back of our minds as we're processing our own identity. What are we tying our rappel ropes off of in life? Or can we form an identity just based off of who's screaming and crying at the moment? And to turn momentarily from the screaming and crying in order to find an anchor point is not to deny that the level of caring was not different. It's the way in which we chose to express our level of care that was different. And so that is something that I think the church has to um, glorify both elements of that and lean into it of saying we have to have our clear anchor points. My hope is built on nothing less. Jesus as a solid rock. And we have to empathize deeply because that is the incarnational heart of God to come and be with us. But, and I'll leave it with this, is to say that it says that Jesus, knowing where, I quote this frequently, but Jesus, knowing where he came from and where he was going, took off his garment, wrapped a towel around him, and washed his disciples' feet. And so he had total certainty and clarity in his identity and who he was and what his mission was. And that stabilized the mission that he had and the service that he rendered to the world. So I think that's really the call for the church, is to say, do I know who I am in Christ? Do we collectively have a vision of what it is that we are trying to do? And in doing so, that's not going to harden our heart toward difficult situations, but it's going to give us a better platform for ministry and for outreach. So we're going to see the needs. We're going to have sympathy. We're going to have compassion. We're not going to change who we are based on who's screaming at the moment, but we're going to look for stable long-term solutions to these things. So that would be, I want to just, I see that as a Christian posture for discipleship and church growth that doesn't necessarily have to be that way in the political realm and atmosphere. And so I personally want to play with these ideas in a sense in which it does not have to become a partisan political boxing match over what we would consider to be normally virtuous terminology.
We will probably come back to this conversation, as we do too many of them, because it's a developing conversation. But thank you very much for listening in. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.